Hey everyone, welcome to the Annoying HR Guy channel where we try and change what you think about HR and what we're actually supposed to do for employees. Today, we're diving deep into the ins and outs of overtime pay. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, covers almost any employee working in any industry, but there's so many rules and exceptions that it's easy to miss out on what you're owed. I'll only cover non-tipped employees in this video, and I'll cover tipped and variable rate employees in another video. So grab a tasty beverage, hit that like button, and feel free to ask questions in the comments. Otherwise, I'll contact your supervisor. Ha 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 ha. Just kidding. Maybe. Okay, let's get it. First up, let's clarify what overtime pay actually means. So under federal law, overtime pay is earned when an employee works more than 40 hours in a work week. That extra time is paid at 1.5 times your regular hourly rate, and that's where it can get confusing. So let's talk about the regular rate because it's not always just your hourly wage. When calculating overtime, the FLSA requires employees to use your regular rate of pay, not just your base rate. This is super important to know and is one of the top reasons for overtime miscalculations. The regular rate includes other forms of compensation like bonuses, commissions, shift differentials, certification pays, and the other things not specifically excluded by law. Let's break it down with a couple of examples so you can calculate your own regular rate. So let's say you work in a job that pays $15 an hour and may think that's somehow a living wage in any time period other than 1982. Anyways, you make $15 an hour and work 45 hours that week. You have no extra pays or compensation, so your regular rate will be $15 an hour. To calculate your overtime rate, we'll multiply 15 times 1.5, which equals $22.50 for every hour of overtime that you work. So you'll be paid 40 hours at $15 an hour and 5 hours at $22.50 an hour. Pretty simple. Let's look at another example. In the same scenario, you work 45 hours at $50 an hour, but you also receive an additional per hour amount due to a professional certification that's worth an extra $2 per hour from your employer. Your regular rate will be your base of 15 plus the $2 per hour for your cert pay, which equals a regular rate of $17 per hour. Now we're going to times that amount by 1.5 and boom, $25.50 for each hour of overtime. Let's look at a somewhat more complex scenario. Imagine that in 1 week you work 45 hours, make $15 an hour, and you receive a $100 bonus. You might think that your overtime would be to 15 times 1.5, but there's more. You have to factor in the $100 bonus, which will increase your overtime rate. So to do that, we do 15 times 45, which gives us your base rate, and add the 100 for the bonus, which equals out to a total of $775 for the week. Now we divide that amount by the total amount of hours of 45, and it gives us a regular rate of $17.72. A whole dollar more than if we didn't include the bonus. To finish it off, we simply multiply that $17.72 times 1.5, which equals to an overtime rate of $26.58 per hour of overtime. Whew, that was kind of a lot. So knowing how to calculate your overtime is important to make sure you're paid correctly, and I'm happy to answer any questions about comments about overtime calculation. Next up, let's talk about things that don't count towards overtime calculation. The federal law does not require that things like holiday, sick, vacation, or PTO time be calculated towards overtime for most jobs. Note that some local and state laws may require overtime in certain situations, so be sure to check that out. An important thing to do today is look at your company's policy manual or contact HR to ask what is and isn't used in the calculation of overtime, because it's super important to know. For example, if you work 35 hours in 1 week and use 8 hours of vacation, and your company excludes vacation use from overtime calculation, then you'll be paid 43 hours of straight time, not overtime. Be sure you know before you unnecessarily burn your leave banks. Now that we've talked about how to calculate it, let's talk about what counts towards the concept of hours worked, which is actual time counted towards pay. This is where a lot of people likely lose out on actual compensable time. Under the FLSA, certain activities might not be considered compensable. For instance, travel time to and from work usually isn't counted, but if you're traveling between job sites or driving to meetings during your normal work hours, that time should be counted. Some of the most common examples of hours worked that can contribute to overtime also include training in meetings, like mandatory training or meetings that should count as work hours, especially if they happen outside of your regular shift, even if it's only 5 minutes. If permitted by your employer, short breaks between 5 to 20 minutes must count as hours worked. But longer breaks, typically 30 minutes or more, should be unpaid if you're free from work duties. If you work during your lunch break, even responding to emails, that's hours worked. It must be compensated. Also, if you're required to be on call and you can't use your time freely, it very likely should count as hours worked. One final note about hours worked. All time that is considered hours worked, even unauthorized time, must be compensated. But if you weren't authorized to work and did anyways, keep in mind that your employer can take disciplinary action against you. So maybe don't clock in early or stay late if you haven't been authorized to do so. Knowing which activities count can make a big difference in your hours. If you're ever unsure, keep track of all your activities and check with HR. Next, you should know that employers usually can't avoid overtime by averaging or combining hours over a pay period or multiple weeks in most cases. For instance, if you work 30 hours one week and 50 the next, your employer might try to say that it balances out to 40 hours each week and tell you to get bent on overtime. But under the FLSA, overtime is calculated on a weekly basis, so in that second week, you're still owed overtime for that 10 extra hours. There are very few exceptions to this, and almost all exceptions are in the public safety and emergency response professions, so make sure you get your money. With the rise of remote work, it's important to know that the same overtime rules apply even if you're working from home. However, remote work brings unique challenges in tracking hours, so keep a record of your start and end times each day, especially if your company doesn't use a standardized time tracking software. This is especially important if you're expected to respond to emails, messages, or perform any type of work outside of your standard hours, as those tasks might count as work time. Finally, let's talk about those who can't earn overtime, officially classified by your employer as exempt employees. One of the biggest schemes by employers is where they classify employees as exempt to avoid paying overtime, but this isn't always correct. Exempt status under the FLSA typically applies to certain salaried positions like executive, administrative, or professional roles, but very specific criteria need to be met, and in 2025, these standards may see an even stricter burden of proof that will have to be satisfied. I want to say this as loud as this AI voice will permit me to. Job titles do not determine exemption status. I'll address exemptions in another video because they are just so very complicated. Finally, if you believe you're not receiving the overtime pay you're owed, there are steps you can take. But first, document everything. Keep track of hours worked, time cards, pay stubs, and communications with your employer. Then consider speaking to HR to clarify your status and understand their policies. If that doesn't resolve things, you can file a complaint with the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, which will investigate claims of unpaid overtime or exempt versus non-exempt misclassification. You can also consult a labor attorney if the issue is significant and you're not getting anywhere. Just don't give up fighting for what's yours. So let's recap it all. First, know the difference between your base pay rate and your regular pay rate, and know how to factor in additional compensation earned so it counts towards overtime. Next, be sure you understand what does and doesn't calculate an overtime by your company's policy and what counts as hours worked by FLSA standards. Finally, if you're unsure if you should be exempt from overtime or if your overtime pay doesn't look right, check with your payroll department, HR, or contact the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. Overtime rules are complex, but knowing your rights can ensure you're paid fairly for every hour you work. Some states like California and Nevada have unique overtime rules that exceed what FLSA requires, so be sure to check into it for your home state as well. I hope this video clarified some common questions and gave you insight into the nuances of overtime law. If you found this video helpful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you have any other workplace questions or ideas for future videos. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.